Well, hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Tanks with CS. As always, it's good to have you back. So, for today's video, we are looking at the Tier 10 German heavy tank, the Maus. It's obviously an iconic and classic vehicle that's been around for a long time in the game. And obviously, in actual history, it was noteworthy for being essentially the heaviest fully enclosed combat vehicle to have ever been conceived, engineered, and designed and built, obviously. And as far as today's video's format is concerned, it's not going to be a simple replay video, or much rather a review video, but it's going to be a little more eclectic and kind of touches upon multiple subtopics, if you will. One of them is my endeavor to get an ace tanker in the tank, essentially ever since when I first got the tank, which has been probably more than a year ago, if you will. Another subtopic we will probably get to talk about a little bit is essentially how this tank was at one point buffed and also fairly recently nerfed, and how that affects how this tank performs and what are the implications of such an attempt to balance the tank, so to speak. And of course, last but not least, you'll probably hopefully get to look at arguably unconventional ways of playing this heavy vehicle, and of course also the conventional ways of playing it, for your entertainment, I suppose. So for today's first replay, we are on Behemoth, which is also essentially one of the earliest maps to be in the game, and one of the earliest maps new players will encounter in the game. Obviously, a city map, arguably the prototypical city map in the game. And you can almost say that this was, or this still remains, one of the best maps for the Maus to best utilize its characteristics, and what makes the tank strong, if you will. Obviously, since the tank weighs over 190 tons and it's not exactly mobile, as almost everybody knows at this point, going hill is probably a bad idea because I will have never gotten into a position on the hill in time to engage enemies. And going west and taking over the rail yard is also a bad idea because even though sure the Maus has a lot of armor, but ultimately it's all about how you use it. The sheer raw amount of it sometimes alone is not enough to make or break your tank, if you will. You also have to consider overmatch and autopan and normalization and angling and modules, tracks and all that. So by going rail yard, I would have given the enemy a chance to put in better shots into me by negating my angle and by exposing my own position. But now since I'm going into the tank alley on the central eastern part of the map, I very much get to make the most out of my armor, because regardless of how strong your armor is, you tend to do best when there's debris and obstacles, because sometimes debris and obstacles can essentially make your weak spots immune. And while you're making weak spots immune, often you can get to make the rest of your armor scheme stronger. For example, as you can see throughout this match, I, for the most part, got a chance to hide my lower plate. And the lower plate of the Maus, if on angle, is probably the only part of the tank that can be reliably penetrated by other Tier 10 non-premium ammunition. If they have 250, 260mm penetration, and I don't angle my lower plate, they can probably go through. And of course, even maybe if I angle a little bit, they can still normalize and go through also. But the upper plate is 200mm at 45 degrees, so unless they shoot gold, there's no chance. The turret front, at this point, had 260mm, and it's curved and angled. Sure, if they get a good shot into the part of the turret front that's perpendicular to their shell's trajectory, they might go through. But they miss by a little bit, I guess the implication of that hit will be drastically different. And obviously one thing about the mouse is, because you're so big and because, your tank is clumsy, almost 200 pounds in weight, even though it has a powerful engine, still, it doesn't accelerate that fast, it doesn't turn that fast. So, being hit in this tank is inevitable. Not to mention, if you look at it, this tank is roughly the size of a small apartment building. So, arguably that's another reason why, you end up being a pretty easy target for artilleries and tank destroyers if you showed up in an open and exposed position. So going back to what I was saying, I guess, it's ultimately more important this tank to know when to how to take a hit, rather than, try to avoid taking a hit. Of course, there are other tanks in the game that will have to, force you to do that, but this is not it. So far, I essentially took this tank to the most contentious choke point on the entire map and drove away with a lot of damage now. So it goes to show what this tank can do. When you weight so much, when you have so much armor, and when you know how to make the most out of the armor. Obviously, in this case, will be how to angle your boxy hull and how to angle, or should I say, make the most out of all the angles and thickness of the armor you have. So, as for today's second replay, we are on Lakeville, and obviously it's tier 10 once again, which tier 10 matchmaking rather than tier 11s or tier 12. So we still get tier 8s on both sides. And I would say that, this replay is probably, arguably, the single most intense engagement I have ever been involved in my mouse. Ever. Throughout the entire ownership of the tank I have. I mean, sure, I probably have had matches in which I did more damage or more spotting, but ultimately, at the end of this match, which unfortunately didn't end so well for us, I had 6.3k worth of damage and 9.7k worth of damage bounce, and also plenty of spots. I would say that really speaks loudly about the tank's potential, if not also, the player base frustration with World of Tanks metagame in this day and age. So obviously, since I'm draining my mouth, to make the most out of my armor, to allow myself to get a hold of some degree of protection and camouflage and cover from enemy artillery as well as enemy tank destroyers, would be for me to go into the town. Because, hypothetically, if I had gone on the central road, I would have been easily spotted and, very easily hit by enemies that probably would have been in pretty solid cover. If I went into the valley, then essentially enemy artillery and tank destroyer will probably just get to play, a game of whack-a-mole on me. I'll peek out in fairly predictable spots, and they will simply hit me where it hurts. But by going to the town, I essentially will force the enemy into engaging me from fairly close range, and to make the most out of all the choke points there are in the town, as well as perhaps making my own tank a part of those choke points. And so far in the beginning of the match, things aren't going so well, because even without being able to get into cover in town, I have already been focused on, spotted, and fired at, and hit. didn't lose that much health, but still, it was a bit of a close call. You can almost argue that the RNG was kind of favorable to me, and they bounced, and some of the modules such as my tracks ate some of the damage. And now I'm filming in town, but by the look of it, things aren't going so well, simply because it seems that my team has deployed and invested very heavily on the central road, which is good for spots and good for getting a hold of enemy intentions and providing some vision and flanking fire. But arguably, you're not going to win the game that way. So right now I'm holding up okay, simply because the mouse has a fairly sound armor scheme, especially if you put it into use in such a compacted and enclosed environment, because you know where the enemy is going to show up, from which direction they're going to shoot at you, and you can compensate the penetration power of your weapons and angle of the fire accordingly. So in this case, I angle my hull in such a way that my side is really thick, it couldn't go through, and my front is also very thick and it couldn't go through. And of course my lower plate is thick enough that their non-premium ammunition doesn't have a chance. Hypothetically in this situation, the enemies should have simply drove around me and overpowered me and outmaneuver my tank, because my tank is relatively slow and clumsy. But nope, they are understandably scared and simply took a more static position and tried to outshoot me. But ultimately, their weapons aren't really able to overcome my armor. Another thing about the mouse that you should know is the fact that the mouse's weapon, for the most part of the tank's existence, had been fairly unremarkable. In the sense that for a very long time the tank had fairly low DPM with a rammer and vent and 100% crew. My tank was only averaging about maybe a 12-second, 13-second reload. To be honest, which would have not been completely out of place even on tier 8 heavy. And then at a point of this replay's recording, if you will, the mouse was buffed. But much rather the buff happened before this replay. Essentially what they did during this buff was they made the weapon handle better than it did before, so he had less bloom. He seems to aim faster, he seems to be more accurate. DPM got buffed tremendously to a point of essentially allowing my tank to have a 10-second flat reload. And also, at this point the tank had 3200 hit points, which is the highest in the entire game. It's probably arguable that maybe Wargaming tried to do this in hopes of balancing out the mouse against Japanese heavies. So going back to the weapon, I guess at this point my DPM is good, my handling is good, but in terms of hard stats, the 128mm gun you get on the mouse, which is essentially a different version of the same gun you get on the E75 at tier 9, is ultimately still not a sniping weapon. Sure, you can say that for a gun that's mostly used for brawling, it's pretty solid and arguably better than some of the traditional Russian style guns like the D25T. In terms of penetration, the gun is somewhat on par with what you expect at tier 10, but also falls short to an extent. I believe he had 246 millimeter penetration, which is somewhat lower than 258, 259 the Americans have, and what the British have on the Conqueror and Super Conqueror. Obviously, also the FV215. And overall, the penetration is probably a little more than 10mm short of the 122mm M62 T2 on the Soviet heavies. But in exchange, this gun also gets more alpha. Since it is somewhat larger caliber weapon at 128 versus 122 and 120. So it actually does as much damage as a 130mm naval gun on the IS-7, which is at 490. So I would say that, after the original buff and before the more recent nerf, this tank had really sound DPM and alpha combination. 10-second reload with the 490 alpha. For a sturdy, large, and heavily armored brawling tank, it really satisfies, really gets the job done. So right now I'm kind of stuck in a good news, a bad news situation. Good news is that I have successfully neutralized the enemies in the city. But the bad news is, by the look of it, my team has been very much defeated by the enemies on both the central road and also the valley, which is predictable despite my team's heavy emphasis on those two areas of contention during our initial deployment. So I have no choice. The enemy Ferdinand, I believe, is actually on cap, and so I have to try to reset the gun. Otherwise, the game will be over before we know it. And after a few misses, I finally managed to neutralize the Ferdinand by shooting HE at the side of his superstructure, because he simply had no health and a splash would have killed him. And hypothetically, even if a splash doesn't kill him, we would have neutralized the enemy's attempt to cap out our base. And unfortunately, right now it's a really difficult situation. The enemies are still creeping upon our cap from the valley. My friendly tank ended up going there, tried to fight it out with the enemy, but ended up getting killed. That was not exactly a favorable thing, simply because we would have had a better chance to beat the enemy if we went together. But he just had to go for it and ignore the fact that I'm also there and I'm simply a slow tank. And he died for it. Meanwhile, I kind of got swarmed by both the enemy tank and also the enemy artillery, and when you have no health left, you die. So it's life. So, today's third, as well as today's last replay, or should I say today's third and fourth replay, both feature the mouse in its form post-nerf, which is from the more recent month of this year. Two things were involved in, I guess, the most nerfing process, the most recent nerfing process. One is, this tank now, or much rather, they minimized the amount of health this tank has. And so it's back to 3000 HP once again, just as before the original buff. And also the DPM of the tank got nerfed. Maybe not to the point of how the tank used to be before the original buff, but at this point my tank had a slightly over 11-second reload on the main gun. So it's statistically slightly better than halfway versus our original buff, so to speak. So this time I find myself on Melanovka, which is arguably one of the worst maps for the mouse, as well as any heavy tanks, especially heavy tanks that have no mobility and no camo. Simply because this map is fairly open. And sure, the map designer kind of made the hill in the northeastern corner of the map a bit of a brawling spot with some hardcover, but just simply because when the enemies notice your team's lineup, and they know that certain tanks are going to be armored heavies that brawls, they know that you're going to be there. And ultimately, the gold spam, the tank destroyers as well as artilleries would have prepared what they would do accordingly. So the problem is that when you're dealing with a map like this, your options are very limited in a tank like this. Often, if you do the unexpected, the overall situation will be so unfavorable to you that things will probably end badly. But if you do the expected, you can essentially know the enemies will be there to do what they gotta do to give you a hard time. So ultimately, for the sake of metagame, for the sake of game balance, for the sake of playability of the game, it's not exactly a favorable thing. But it's wargaming, and they do what they do, right? I don't think reason it's their number one priority and objective when it comes to design and balancing the game, unfortunately. So what's happening in this game is that originally I tried to go for the hill, but then I quickly realized the enemies made a pretty daring attempt to rush the river on the southwestern corner of the map. And hypothetically, if they succeed with this process, they would have essentially got a pretty solid hold on our base. They would have provided SWATs of our base. The enemies from further away would have been able to put fairly solid flanking fire into our base, and probably some of our defenders, and if not, our tanks who are still in the process of going onto the hill. So, had they succeeded, we could have easily been in trouble. But since, I was kind of frustrated about going hill, and, I thought that perhaps if I go this side, make the enemies push attempt lose, or make it fail, perhaps you can somehow achieve, to a degree, a localized superiority in terms of the quantity of tanks we have. Numerical superiority, so to speak. And looks like the plan is working. So we blunted the enemy push, and we pushed in return. Simply because, after the enemy push failed, they just simply had less tanks on this side of the map. So they were less able to essentially counter our counterattack. In warfare, you always want to exploit the enemy at the right time. And sometimes you have to wait for it. Sometimes, it's like a game of chess. You have to use a sequence of various actions to bait enemies, or to coerce the enemies, or to encourage the enemies into doing certain things a certain way at a certain time. And then perhaps there will be a situation that will be more favorable to your ultimate objective, if you will. But, tanks is not really a strategy game, and I'm sure most of the kids in this game just doesn't give a damn. So simply because the enemy push failed, and we managed to get a foothold onto their base, ironically, we can now consistently put into flanking fire onto these enemies that are engaging the rest of my team in the northeast. Because, essentially the western flank of their base essentially give you a perfect vantage point onto the enemy's exposed and weakly armored flank. And normally one will argue that what I'm doing right now could have been, or would have been something that should be done if you are in a light tank, or if you're in a relatively mobile medium tank, or even a mobile heavy tank. But ironically, what I'm doing is working nonetheless. Because sure, if I was in a faster tank, there's going to be less of a chance of me being shot. And obviously less of a chance of me being shot at. But since, we neutralized so many enemy units to begin with, there's just simply not that many enemy guns to fire back at you. Another thing to consider is that, sometimes when you are driving a smaller tank and a lighter tank, the mobility and your stealth and, your concealment, your camouflage allow you to not be seen by the enemies and to allow you to not be hit by the enemies. And, if you're seen by the enemies, perhaps, you're seen later. You're seen when you are already in position. And in the mouse, you don't really have the luxury. But what you do have is your armor. So, ultimately, the trade-off is, perhaps you will get hit more in the mouse or, in a heavy armor tank. And perhaps, because you move slower, there's going to be more chance of you being hit. But simply because, you have your armor, and perhaps, if you figure out a way to make the most of your armor, ironically, the enemies can shoot at you, but their shooting will end up being fairly inconsequential just simply because they couldn't harm you, they couldn't go through your armor. And obviously in this case, I noticed the enemies are kind of focused to the northern side of the map, especially after the southern push failed, so they simply do not have enough units to cover both sides of the map. So yes, to an extent I kind of exploited the situation and pushed up. I would say that, maybe another thing to notice about, scouting and spotting a tank with essentially no camo is the fact that, because you're easily seen and you're more likely to be shot at by the enemies, hypothetically speaking, or, academic terms, there's more of an incentive for the enemies to fire. But what happens is that, when the enemies do fire, they're also exposing themselves. So, sure, I could be a T-100, light tank, tier 10 Soviet right now, and the enemies don't see me. But ironically, probably because, since the enemies aren't also firing at me, I don't see them as easily in return also. It's almost the same principle as in, how some people can scout the field on Melanovka in T-95. Not because, they saw the enemies before the enemies saw him, but much rather because the guy drove into the open and, enticed the enemy to shoot at him, which in turn, exposed all the enemies and I guess, in a sense, they bring ruin upon themselves, so to speak. And as you can see, the gun on the mouse is not really a sniping weapon. Even though it's not terrible for it, it's also not made for it. So, last but not the least, we have one last replay in the mouse after the nerf, which is also after the previous buff. I still only have 3000 HP and the DPM has also been nerfed. I have about an 11-second reload on this tank, and we are in or should I say we are on the new check map. Maybe it's not so new anymore, but you know, it's all relative, right? So to start, I decided to go towards the western side of the map simply because, you know, there's, you know, essentially these warehouses or factory plants, you know, abandoned architecture to be exact, that kind of affords you some degree of hard cover, obviously from, you know, both enemy spots and also enemy fire. If I've gone to the eastern side of the map, once again, I will be exposing open field, which is, you know, more likely than not exactly a favorable situation, even though, you know, as I shown in last game, it could be done. You know, but it all depends. There's too many wildcard factors at play, so to speak. Another unfortunate thing about the mouse is that sometimes, because, you know, its mobility is not so great, and you only do 20 kilometers per hour in a straight line on pretty good ground, sometimes, you know, your allies will get into position before you. You know, that might not sound like a bad thing until you know, your allies go into these compromised situations and get themselves beat up even before you're in position to help. People are just eager, you know. They try to equate gaming with instant gratification, but, you know, that's not really the way it works. But one thing you can argue about the mouse's gun handling and firepower is the fact that, you know, sure, in terms of absolute aim accuracy, in terms of absolute stationary aim time, it doesn't feel fantastic, but, you know, its practical amount of bloom in a mid-range or close-range bowling situation, it's fairly usable and minimal. You know, sure, you might, you know, in comparison to this, end up with a tank like the Centurion 1 or Centurion 7, in which, you know, your stationary aimed accuracy and aim time are all fantastic, but then, you know, you move your track a little bit, you move the turret a little bit, your boom just dilates and goes to crap. Not the case with the mouse. So as you can see, I had no problem putting two fairly incidental and opportunistic flanking shots into the enemy's Centurion. Obviously, the first shot barely through his somewhat covered lower plate, and the second time even through his insufficiently angled side hull, which had, you know, I believe at the point of this patch was still before the buff, which is 50mm versus the current 75. So that means, you know, for a 128mm shell, if it kisses, you know, the guy's armor, you just go right through. And ultimately, even with the DPM nerf, you know, you still want to make the most out of, you know, your every shot. You know, this is, in terms of playstyles, not exactly a JPE 100 or a FV 1A3, because, you know, those guys have essentially a 20-second plus, or give or take, reload. The mouse is still reloads in 11 seconds, which is, you know, fairly conventional heavy reload territory, if you will. So as you can see, on multiple occasions in this game, I had a chance to shoot at multiple enemies, and I have to consider, you know, who to shoot. You know, you have to consider which enemy is most dangerous to you. You have to consider which enemy is positioned in such a way that he's most vulnerable to being hit. You also have to consider which enemy is of the greatest threat to your team. It's all about risk assessment sometimes. Because ultimately, you know, neutralizing a dangerous enemy quick can sometimes win you the game. And then also, it's fairly important for you to focus on enemies you can damage. Because, you know, sure, there's always going to be enemies you can hit, But if you couldn't damage because the guy's angled, because the guy is using hard cover, because the guy is side scraping and so on and so forth, then your shot is nothing more than a loud bang and fireworks. It looks pretty, but it doesn't do anything beyond that. And unfortunately, I would say that most noobs in shooter games will simply just blindly go into any given environment, firing and brandishing and boasting whatever hell they have, even though their action is pretty futile and useless. Nothing new. You know how it is. As you can see, when you're driving other tanks, perhaps you are always moving forward. Perhaps you are, considering your trajectory in a way as if you are driving your car. You're mostly moving in a directional manner, and what you do with your tank's movements is all about going somewhere. But with the mouse, it's almost different in the sense that it's almost as if you are positioning and managing this semi-stationary fortification. So it's less important for you to change your position from one spot to another spot in the map, but much rather, instead of doing that, you have to constantly assess your environment. You have to constantly assess the positions, the locations, and the capabilities, the intentions of your enemies around you. You have to constantly adjust your position, your angle, the orientation of your hull accordingly. Because how you place yourself very much determines how likely or how badly the enemy can damage you or can frustrate your ability to survive. I would say that that's something that people need to learn in super heavy driving 101. But ultimately, tanks is kind of semi-sophisticated of a game versus something like Grand Theft Auto, because I don't believe vehicles in that game had complex damage models and complex armor modules and all this game mechanics that influence what various different weapons will do upon various different physical material. But of course, on the other end of the spectrum, tank is nowhere near as sophisticated as something like War Thunder, which is almost a simulator. Highly accurate, very detailed model, and arguably accurate to a fault. Because in War Thunder, as is the case in real life, sometimes a penetrating hit means you die. In tanks, you got health to play with. It's a very different ball game. So the first game, I did over 6K, but it was only second class. Obviously got steel wall and high caliber. Without a question, did most of the damage on my team. Very solid game, but it goes to show that arguably, in order for you to have an even better game, you don't really need worse enemies, but you need worse allies who will end up dying early and doing less themselves and making you try to do more, or force you to do more, so to speak. As with the second game, I got high caliber, a lot of profits, and first class. And unfortunately it was a loss because I got spammed by the enemy artillery and my allies died too fast and couldn't do enough. I did 6.3k, bounced 9.7k as I mentioned before, and had plenty of spots. It goes to show that proper utilization and usage of a tank in the ideal situation can really get you pretty far and achieve a very solid tactical victory. But when you're stuck with a team like that, you can end up winning your own battle and losing war. kind of happen in real life too. In the end, you got to kamikaze or take your cyanide or so on and so forth. Kind of dark, but it is what it is. So with the third replay, I did a modest amount, balanced the modest amount, and spotted a pretty solid amount. It goes to show that sometimes when you might not have mobility, you ironically make up for your lack of that with fairly solid armor. And ironically, the enemies, by attempting to damage you, ended up backfiring and damaging themselves in return. And last but not least, it goes to show that after the final nerf on the mouse, you can get a first class badge in the tank without doing nearly as much damage and bouncing nearly as much as before.